Go. And let's get the text shared. Are then we're gonna that business. There we go. All right, so I'm about 30 seconds early, so we'll give it a couple seconds to let other people log into the live stream and let everybody settle in. Just about begin here in a moment. Just waiting for any last logins. It's always nice to let people start from the beginning, but I also don't want to excessively delay when there is a lot to discuss. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and get things moving. So it's good to see everybody. Wonderful to be back and studying our topic. I know that suffering doesn't always feel like the most enjoyable topic to study, but we are turning into the section 2 of this program. Section 1 was trying to capture the fact that suffering is real, the fact that suffering is terrible, the fact that suffering might occasionally have a few explanations in the most extreme circumstances, but that one, we are not allowed to tell someone else what is causing their suffering, and two, we have options even for our own self of how we reflect on the problems we face and whether or not we wish to call them a positive or healthy suffering, what we call isurim ahava, sufferings out of love, or whether they are things that we wish to escape from and remove. And we saw in the 3 test cases where the rabbis were each suffering that every single one of them chose to have the suffering removed. While there can be nobility in suffering, especially suffering that can't be escaped, when there is an option, 9 times out of 10, you're going to find that Judaism recommends looking to end the suffering. However, part 2 of this series on suffering is going to be looking at some of the different responses to suffering that we might take. While it is true that we often are looking for the solutions to suffering, the ways to fix it, sometimes, well, it doesn't feel like we have an easy fix. And so then the question is, how do we mentally and spiritually approach, allow ourselves to experience this suffering? And we're going to look at different and, as usual, mutually contradictory techniques. We're going to do just one basic technique for today, but we will be finding over the next few weeks some variations, some alternatives as well. Why is this important? Well, because at different times, we need to have different responses to different situations. There is no one-size-fits-all explanation for suffering, nor is there one-size-fits-all explanation for how to respond to suffering. And so we'll have to look at multiple in order to add them to our tool chest. And depending upon the situation that we are in, we'll be able to reach for one or the other and find the one that is most appropriate for that time. So again, what we're going to look at today is not meant as the one-size-fits-all universal approach to all suffering for all time, for all people. No such thing exists. This is an approach and one that has certain difficulties and challenges, which we will talk about. But let's go ahead and get it on the table because it is one that can be useful in many situations and thus is important to have in our toolkit for much of our experiences. So our texts today will be coming from the Talmud, and they are dealing with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is considered one of the greats of rabbinic literature. He lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, that is, in the 100s of the Common Era was when he was most important, and he was very famous for supporting the Bar Kokhba revolt, the revolt that went against the Romans and won for a few years, but then eventually led to a new wave of destruction, persecution, and diaspora for our people. As such, he is somebody that knows suffering very well firsthand. With that in mind, let's take a look at one of the anecdotes about him and what it reveals about his philosophy on this topic. The Gemara relates, when Rabbi Akiva was walking along the road and came to a certain city, he inquired about lodging, and they did not give him any. So he's looking for a place to stay. There is no place for him to stay. So now his life is a little bit worse. This is that minimal form of suffering that many of us will experience routinely. And his response, he said, everything that God does, he does for the best, right? This is for the good. This is for the best. He is not complaining about the lack of lodging. He is not upset. He is simply recognizing, it's for the best. Now, you will note that he is saying that God is the one in charge, that it was God who arranged the lack of residence for him, that there was no lodging because it was part of God's plan. Keep that in mind as we go forward, because that may become difficult to square with every circumstance. But for the moment, he has no problem saying to himself, God arranged this, and therefore it is fine. He went and slept in a field. Well, no place in town, so he just camps out outside. And he had with him a rooster, meaning an alarm clock, a donkey for travel and for luggage, and a candle for light. Pre-modern world, it's not so easy to see in the dark. A gust of wind came and extinguished the candle. A cat came and ate the rooster, and a lion came and ate the donkey. He said, everything that God does, he does for the best. All right, so he gets 3 more problems. Candle goes out, not such a big deal. The rooster gets killed, well, that's a little bit more severe. And then a lion comes along and eats the donkey. That is really getting into terrible territory. But his response for all of that is the same. Everything that God does, he does for the best. This is part of God's plan. This is part of God's world. Who am I to judge? Really hearkening back to that response at the end of the book of Job. Who am I to judge when the one who measures the oceans in his hand is laying out the universe? I cannot fathom what is going on, but it is for the best. Now, that night, an army came and took the city into captivity. As I said, he lived during times of great trouble in Israel, and this is something that would often happen. So an army would have come in, would have captured the city, and would have taken people away as slaves. So therefore, it turned out that Rabbi Akiva alone, who was not in the city and had lit no candle and had no lit candle, noisy rooster or donkey to give away his location, was saved. He said to them, meaning to the others, didn't I tell you everything that God does, he does for the best? All right, so Rabbi Akiva is trying to share a perspective that is giving him comfort when something is going wrong. Meaning that since this is part of God's plan, it must ultimately be for the best. And for himself, he is showing in a very condensed version how that might play out, where they don't have any place for you to sleep. Okay, so you sleep outside the city. Maybe the city would be attacked, and now you're better off that you slept outside the city. You don't have your donkey anymore because the lion came. Well, maybe it's better because now the donkey won't give you away to the troops. That for every bad situation, there is a counter situation that you are avoiding that could have been worse. And indeed, for many situations, this is a very healthy and very appropriate response. All the lights on the way to work are red, so you arrive late, and maybe even your boss is upset at you. Well, yes, but if you had gone through some of those lights and made it earlier, perhaps you would have been in an accident at the next intersection where somebody ran a red light. Perhaps you would have had a flat tire because you hit some random piece of debris on the road. Perhaps when you arrived at work early, there would have been some other confrontation that would have caused you even more grief than coming late. That For every problem you're currently experiencing, there is a worse problem you might be avoiding. And therefore, even though the current situation feels like a problem, an inconvenience, or even suffering, there might be the alternative out there that could be even worse. Now, this technique works in many, many situations, um, especially those where it is relatively low stakes. Uh, Losing your candle, losing the rooster, even losing your donkey. Um, it's easy to imagine something much worse, even if it's not as obvious or as soon as the issue here of the town being taken into captivity. With larger problems or larger life-changing events, sometimes it is harder to see. Sometimes we may feel that a job that we've been fired from, that is creating a huge amount of problem for ourselves, for our families. But perhaps it is for the best, and it is the necessary catalyst for a change of job or of location that leads to a better quality of life, maybe 10, 15, 20 years down the road than would have happened had you not lost the job. Those are harder to measure, and they are definitely harder to feel at the time. Now, this is not coming to directly contradict our attempt to solve these problems. It is coming for when we do not have a solution. After all, if he had had another rooster, he would have had the other rooster out. If he'd had another donkey, he would have had the other donkey out. He wouldn't have said, when the first donkey died, oh, I better kill my spare donkey because clearly God wants my donkey dead. Instead, he is responding to a tragedy that has no solution in his immediate moment. There is nothing he can do about the burnt out candle, the burnt out, or the dead rooster, the dead donkey, or the lack of lodging. So instead, he is trying to console himself by saying, it could be worse. This is the best of the options that are available. Now, with that in mind, we are introduced to one of the limitations of this mentality, this approach, by the very end of the story. While it stands as a remarkable lesson of how all these bad things happening to him actually saved his life, we are still left with the reality that the rest of the city was taken into captivity. And that ain't great. And for the people who have just been taken as slaves, to say everything that God does, he does for the best, is going to be a very bitter pill to swallow. To say that I'm sure this is the best when you're being taken away in chains or your family has been killed in the attack on the town, that may be asking a little much of this particular philosophy, of this particular perspective. And so we need to make sure we keep that in mind as we go. Now, that's not to say that you can't use it in those circumstances. As we are going to see, Rabbi Akiva does kind of walk the walk when it comes to him being on the worst end of these types of situations. So let's go ahead and take a look at our next incident, which is dealing with him as well, but in a slightly less personal problem, but a critical problem for all of our people. The Gemara the Gemara relates another incident involving those sages. This is taken from a series of stories in the book of Makot. On another occasion, they were ascending to Jerusalem. Now, this is, like I said, in the 2nd century CE, which means this is after the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70, in the 1st century CE. So, when they arrive at Mount Scopus and saw the site of the temple, they rent their garments in mourning, in keeping with halakhic practice. Now, understand that when they see the site of the temple, what they mean is they are looking down at the ruins of where the temple once stood. This is decades after the destruction. The entire area has been left in ruins and just devastation. And of course, our people are also continuing with life, but are struggling under this Roman oppression. Now, they go up then. When they arrived at the Temple Mount, they saw a fox that emerged from the site of the Holy of Holies. So they see the area where the Holy of Holies, where the holiest point on the Temple Mount was itself, and they see a fox coming out from among the stones, from among the rubble. This has been turned literally into a place of non-human habitation. Uh, the idea that animals were living here shows that the area that had been so sacred and so special has been returned to not just a desanctified area, but almost as though it were completely wilderness. And they began weeping, meaning the other rabbis with them, because they are witnessing this horrible degradation, destruction. It is so symbolic of where the Jewish people are at this moment in history. And Rabbi Akiva was laughing. All right. Rabbi Akiva's laughing while standing in the ruins and watching an animal come out of the Holy of Holies. Everyone else's natural response is to cry, which I think most of us would assume is the natural response. They are looking at this symbol of national tragedy, of national suffering, and the normal response is to cry. But Rabbi Akiva is laughing. All right. So can we just project onto this whatever God does for the best? That is his response? Well, ish. Let's see how he takes this in more detail. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing?" Normal question. Rabbi Akiva said to them, "For what reason are you weeping?" I mean, that's obvious, right? They said to him, "This is the place concerning which it is written, and the non-priest who approaches shall die. And now foxes in it walk in it, and shall we not weep?" I mean, this was a place that even the Kohen Gadol couldn't go in except for Yom Kippur. That's how special, sacred, and amazing it was. And now there's just a wild animal running, to and fro. Of course we're crying. This shows you exactly how much of this has been destroyed. But Rabbi Akiva, of course, has a different perspective. Rabbi Akiva said to them, "That is why I am laughing," meaning for the same reason that you are crying, I am laughing. Let him explain. As it is written, when God revealed the future to the prophet Isaiah, "And I will take to me faithful witnesses to attest, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jebechiah." Now, what is the connection between Uriah and Zechariah? Right? How are those connected? Why put them into the same verse? Well, he clarifies the difficulty. Uriah prophesied during the first temple period, which predates Rabbi Akiva and his comrades by many, many centuries. And Zechariah prophesied during the second temple period, meaning he was among those who returned to Zion from Babylon. Still a couple centuries before Rabbi Akiva, but obviously closer in time. And these two epochs, the first temple and second temple period, are now being linked through this verse in Isaiah. Rather, meaning the reason why these two are mentioned together in this same verse, the verse established that the fulfillment of the prophet of Zechariah is dependent on the fulfillment of the prophecy of Uriah, meaning that Uriah's prophecy has to come true first before Zechariah's prophecy will come true. Now, if you're wondering what these prophecies are, don't worry, it's coming. In the prophecy of Uriah, it is written, "Therefore, for your sake, Zion shall be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become rubble, and the Temple Mount as the high places of a forest," meaning the uninhabited wilderness areas where foxes are found. There is a rabbinic tradition that this was prophesied by Uriah. So we hold that this line from Micah is actually from the prophet Uriah, and it is talking very clearly about the destruction that they are currently seeing, that it has been leveled, turned to rubble, plowed like a field, meaning not even one stone standing on top of another one. So that has now been fulfilled. In the prophecy of Zechariah, it is written, "There shall yet be elderly men and elderly women sitting in the streets of Jerusalem." Now, that is a positive vision for the future, that the old will be able to grow and live in peace in the city of Jerusalem. Until the prophecy of Uriah with regard to the destruction of the city was fulfilled, I was afraid that the prophet of Zechariah would not be fulfilled, as the two prophecies are linked. Now that the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, it is evident that the prophecy of Zechariah remains valid. Gemara adds, the sages said to him, employing this information, meaning this formulation, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. Okay, so he helped them to overcome their grief at this moment by pointing out that we have a prophecy of destruction and we have a prophecy of restoration. The prophecy of destruction being fulfilled means that the prophecy of restoration can also be fulfilled. Now, does this exactly fit the whatever God does for the best phrase that we saw at the very beginning? Well, it's debatable. On the one hand, it certainly seems like Akiva is keeping up his positive attitude, that he is looking at what most would consider to be the worst possible situation, and is finding in it not the counterfactual that we discussed in the first paragraph, but instead a promise of better days to come. That if we are going to truly take this seriously, then we have to understand that if the prophecies of destruction have come true, then the prophecies of restoration likewise are equally valid and will eventually come true. And therefore, we can look at something even as bad as the destruction of the temple and everything that went with it as being part of the plan. And that plan includes the restoration, it includes redemption. And therefore, it's not good, but it is actually proof that good will come. Now, is this unnecessarily Pollyannic? Is this overly optimistic? Is this likely to lead to mistakes? Well, it depends on the situation. Certainly, the idea that with the destruction of the temple, we saw many prophecies fulfilled from the first temple period, and we can then feel assured that prophecies of redemption will also, in their day, eventually be filled. That is important, and that is something that has sustained the Jewish people for thousands of years. However, there is a latent danger, and it is a danger that Rabbi Akiva is going to learn far too well, which is to say, I've now seen with my own eyes the prophecy of Uriah be fulfilled, so therefore I can have certainty that the prophecy of Zechariah and the prophecy of redemption is going to be fulfilled likewise before my own eyes, in my own days, right here and now. Hey, Bar Kokhba, I bet you're the Messiah. Let's lead a revolt against Rome. Essentially, this attitude leads Rabbi Akiva and many others to rise up in revolt against Rome, believing that the time for the prophecy of redemption's fulfillment is at hand. And of course, this leads to a horrible period of destruction and death and the just shattering of the Jewish community that was still holding on in the land of Israel. While it is not the end, far from it, there's still many more generations of strong communities. This is the beginning of the end, if you will. This is where the tipping point where life begins to become unbearable in a more consistent pattern. There are still some upticks. Certainly the generation of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is stabilized. The Mishnah is made, great scholarship, obviously. But as far as the thriving of our people goes, this Bar Kokhba revolt that was inspired by a belief that the Messiah was coming in their day, well, it led to a lot of problems for our people. So is it a good response to witnessing tragedy, to recognize that if we believe that the tragedy was foretold, then we should also believe the foretelling of its redemption? Yes, that is a very powerful, very useful model. Does that mean that we get to go to the bank and say, I'd like to cash my check for redemption today, please, and just deal with the consequences? Well, that takes a little bit more reflection. This is a contentious point, I will admit, and one that we will have to come back to of how we respond to tragedy and difficulty with other teachers. But for the moment, in the life of Rabbi Akiva, this does lead to not only national, but also personal tragedy. And that personal tragedy is what we're going to begin to take a look at here. different part of the Talmud, section known as Menachot, and we have a discussion of what Moses experienced when he went up to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. That he didn't only go up there and receive the book, but that he was witness, if you will, to the process of God's creation of the Torah itself. And that's going to involve a very powerful teaching about Rabbi Akiva and about suffering. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. If you are a regular Torah reader, you'll know exactly what they mean. If you're not, on the font that is used when writing a letter in the Torah, there are certain letters that have little extra filigree, extra fancy bits on the edges of certain letters. And the question here is, why are we doing that? Right? Why are there extra little flourishes on the font? And this is an explanation, and let's see how it goes. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, who was preventing you, meaning from giving the Torah without these additions? Meaning, who told you, God, that you had to put little tiny decorative elements to the font? I mean, couldn't you have just handed it over? Wouldn't you be done by now? Couldn't you have finished earlier? This is obviously all rhetorical and metaphorical. We'll come back to what that means in just a minute. God said to him, there is a man who is destined to be born after several generations, meaning from you, Moses, from this time period. God said to him, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name. He is destined to derive from each and every thorn, meaning point of these crowns, mounds upon mounds of halachot, meaning it is for his sake, Akiva's sake, that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah. All right, so God is giving a response to Moses and saying, I know they seem unnecessary to you, but eventually, 1,000 years later, there is going to be somebody who, when they are analyzing the Torah, will look at these extra filigrees and their placement and will be able to derive much of what I wish, is saying God, from the Torah to be expounded as halachot, as Jewish law. That these are not accidental, these are not purely decorative, because there will come somebody who will see in them insights into how to teach Jewish law. Okay, good answer. Moses is impressed. And Moses said before God, Master of the universe, show him to me, right? Please, God, let me witness what it is that he will do, who he is. This sounds like an amazing person. God said to him, return behind you. This is sort of a transitionary idiom, meaning like turn around or wait here a second. Meaning there's a prophetic vision that is being given, that there is a time travel episode happening. Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall and did not understand what they were saying. All right. Moses goes to the back of the room, meaning that he is the least of the students in the room, as it was the custom at that time for students to sit in their class ranking. The most talented, most knowledgeable students would sit at the front, and then there was a descending order to the back of the room for the students that were the newest or the least capable. And of all of them, Rabbi Akiva is at the back. Moses is at the back. Now, that is already making a pretty astonishing claim that Moses himself would be considered a low-ranking student compared to the disciples of Rabbi Akiva, let alone to Rabbi Akiva himself. And Moses is a little, well, confused by all of this. Moses' strength waned as he thought his Torah knowledge was deficient. So Moses is sitting there going, what are they talking about? I don't understand a single thing they're doing. I don't understand this halakha. I, who received the Torah first and am giving it to the nation, I am lost in their discussions. Now, we, as moderns and as people who have studied now for 3,000 years, we can certainly understand that because we know that further generations of study can often lead to insights that the early generations were unaware of. That is no shame, that is no problem. But in this particular context, to say that there is something that Moses didn't know that Akiva did does seem to be flipping the narrative on its head. When Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, his students said to him, "My teacher, from where do you derive this?" Meaning, okay, what's the source of this, Rabbi? And Rabbi Akiva said to them, "It is a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai." Meaning, this is an oral tradition that comes from Moses to us directly. When Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease. Commentary saying, as this too was part of the Torah that he was to receive. So the idea here is that Moses is still mentioned in the study. Moses is still the original source of the study. And while Moses himself may be a little lost about its application 1,000+ years later, it is still derived from what Moses had revealed at that time. And as such, Moses realizes this is still the same Torah, that this is still the same revelation. This is still what he brought, and that therefore it is not beyond him. He just hasn't kept up because he hasn't lived during the intervening time period. Time travel is always weird. And therefore he is a little confused about what applications there are, but he can see now that the roots indeed are still locked in the Torah itself. Okay, so Moses is now fine. Rabbi Akiva is amazing. Everything is good. Roll credits. We could be done right here. But that's not how the story goes. Moses returned, meaning he goes back to Mount Sinai in its normal time. He is now back in his own time, and came before the Holy One, blessed be he, and said before him, "Master of the universe, you have a man as great as this, and yet you still choose to give the Torah through me? Why?" God said to him, "Be silent. This intention arose before me." All right, we're back at Job. Look how amazing Rabbi Akiva is. Why didn't you let him be the one to give Torah for the first time? I mean, yes, he's a great teacher and I'm amazing for his generation, but he's amazing for my generation. You could have just waited and let Torah come through him. And he wants to understand. That's to say, Moses wants to understand why God did what God did, why God gave Torah through Moses and not through Rabbi Akiva. And God's answer is essentially the same answer that we receive at the end of the book of Job. You wouldn't understand. These are my thoughts. This is the thought that I need to act upon. And the intricacies of it, the necessity of it, the perfection of it is not something that is subject to human criticism, that we as humans cannot hope to crack open the formula and understand inside why it was that God gave the Torah through Moses rather than gave the Torah through Rabbi Akiva. Now, we can hypothesize, we can come up with all sorts of explanations. I mean, the simplest, of course, would be that Rabbi Akiva wouldn't be Rabbi Akiva if Moses hadn't been Moses. That Rabbi Akiva may have had the potential within him to become who he was. And indeed, he had to work very hard late in life because he didn't start studying Torah until he was much older to become a great rabbi. But that doesn't mean that he would have done that had Moses not given the Torah. If there hadn't already been the foundation of Judaism in the Jewish world with the Torah being given when Moses was alive, maybe Rabbi Akiva wouldn't have become the amazing person that he was. Likewise, we can argue that if God had delayed the giving of the Torah, the Jewish people would never have materialized, because after our exodus from Egypt, what would have kept us together if we had not had the Torah? That it was necessary in that generation, even more so than it was necessary to be given by someone like Rabbi Akiva. Now, all of those are perfectly fine answers, and we could come up with 100 more at least of why the timeline of history was best served by giving the Torah at Moses rather than Akiva. We could also come up with different explanations for why Moses as a personality, as a human, as an individual spirit was the best transmitter of Torah. All of that is easily discussed another time. But what's important here is the response is saying, I'm not going to give you an explanation. I'm not going to justify my decision. That any justification would be pointless for God to give to humanity. Now, we can sort of set that to one side and say, well, I guess that's, kind of like we talked about in our last session when we talked about God is going to do what God is going to do. But when we get to the second half, maybe that gets a little bit more poignant. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, you have shown me Rabbi Akiva's Torah. Now show me his reward. Meaning, okay, I get it. Maybe you can't explain to me why I'm giving the Torah rather than this amazing person, but at least show me what reward he gets for being this amazing teacher. God said to him, return, meaning go back into that timeline where you were. And Moses went back and saw that they were weighing Rabbi Akiva's flesh in a butcher shop, as Rabbi Akiva was tortured to death by the Romans. So Rabbi Akiva was murdered by the Romans after the Bar Kokhba revolt. He was one of the not exactly ringleaders, but he was a very important spiritual leader during this time period. And when the Romans were done with the crushing the military, they crushed the rabbis that had been instrumental as well. And Rabbi Akiva was taken to public and had his skin ripped off with iron cones while he was still alive. And then the meat was sold as souvenirs. That doesn't really feel like a reward. I mean, is this fair? Is that just? His suffering would have been monumental from the mode of his death, and the disgrace and disgusting way that his remains were treated is even worse. I mean, this is somehow right. How is that fair? Moses said before God, Master of the universe, this is the Torah and this is the reward? These don't match up. I thought it was do good, do bad, get bad. But he did good, he did great, and he's getting worse than almost any possible punishment we ever would think of giving to a person who had done the most despicable of crimes. How does that work? God said to him, be silent. This intention arose before me, meaning this is my thought, and thus it is done. And we are left going, okay, that doesn't seem fair. But God says that this is right. Not that it's going to be understandable by us, but that it is correct for that particular moment. And that should leave us feeling very disoriented. And again, something we've talked about for many weeks is we are supposed to feel uncomfortable with suffering. We are supposed to ask these questions because we are not supposed to think that we understand why the thing happened. We are not supposed to think, oh, well, maybe Rabbi Akiva had done something really bad in secret and this was the right punishment. We're not supposed to think like that. We are supposed to think from our point of view, this makes no sense. But from the story and from the text that we saw before, we are supposed to try and look for a feeling of, but it will be okay. It doesn't mean I have to like this. It doesn't mean I have to feel this is right. It doesn't mean I have to justify it as fair. And in fact, I probably shouldn't justify this as fair, because that would be a horrible insult to Rabbi Akiva. But I can think God is still around, that the suffering does not show the absence of God. The suffering does not show the absence of God trying to move the world towards its right destination. Now, in the third part, which is some weeks away, but in the third part of the series, we are going to talk about why suffering is even possible in this world, of why it even is allowed to occur. So far, we've been dealing more with the it happens and how do we relate to it. But we're going to go back into that theology of, well, Why does it even happen in the first place? Not on the case by case, but why is there suffering at all? So if you've got questions about that, hold on to them, and we'll come back to them in the fullness of time. But for the moment, we have to ask ourselves the question: was Rabbi Akiva still so sanguine? Everything God does for the best while he was being murdered? Was that his attitude up to the end, or was that his attitude only when it was about his candle, his rooster, and his donkey? But when it comes to this, maybe he had a very different feeling. Well, to answer that question, we will turn to the story of his death in a little more detail. The Gemara relates, when they took Rabbi Akiva out to be executed, it was time for the recitation of the Shema. A reminder that we say the Shema twice a day, both at nighttime and then also in the morning. So this is the time of day when you are supposed to be saying the Shema, and he is there being executed. Now, most people would say, well, I guess if it's my execution, I the mitzvah of saying the Shema, because after all, I'll be dead in a second after this excruciating pain. But Rabbi Akiva is a little different. And they were raking his flesh with iron combs. Like I mentioned, these were sort of hooked pieces of metal to drag out the skin. It's just horrible, horrible. Romans are very creative. And he was reciting Shema, thereby accepting upon himself the yoke of heaven. Right? Ol Malchut Shamayim, the yoke of heaven, is the sign that we accept that God is God, that God is the ruler of the world, that God is the ultimate source of everything, good and bad. And in a sense, what Rabbi Akiva is saying by saying the Shema at this particular moment is that he still believes in God. He still believes in God's rightness. He still believes in everything that he has believed up to this point, that his faith is not any different. Now, his students are having a hard time with this. As you can imagine, they are gathered there to try and support their teacher in his death. But this seems to just boggle their mind. His students said to him, "Our teacher, even now," meaning as you suffer, you recite the Shema? How? It's okay to miss one recitation. You're going to be dead. God will understand. God is not going to, dock your grade book because you didn't say the Shema while being murdered. It's okay. He said to them, "All my days I have been troubled by the verse, with all your soul," meaning the verse from Deuteronomy that's found in the Ve'ahavta, where we say that we will love the Lord our God with all our soul, and heart and might as well in that list. Well, what does that verse mean, that I love God with all my soul? Well, it means, according to Rabbi Akiva, even if God takes your soul, meaning that even if you are dying, you should still be loving God, because that's what it is to love God. We don't love God the way a pet might lick our hand when we give them a treat, and only when we give a treat, and bite our hand if we don't give them a treat. We love God good and bad. We love God when things are wonderful and when things are terrible. Our soul, even as it leaves this world, should still be clinging to God as it is being pulled from the body. And I said to myself, said Rabbi Akiva, when will the opportunity be afforded to me to fulfill this verse? How do I do that? Not how do I do it, like what would I do at the moment? But it's not normal for most of us to know the precise moment that we are dying. It especially in the ancient world, usually came fairly quickly. And we didn't often have a good way to schedule it. And so Rabbi Akiva, prior to his martyrdom, has worried for any number of years that he will never have an opportunity to actually show that he would love God with all of his soul, that even as God was taking his soul, that he still loved God. But now now that it's been afforded to me the opportunity to actually show this, shall I not fulfill it? So I've always wondered how I would ever be able to do that part of the mitzvah, because I would never be able to schedule it. But here that it's actually come through the horrible vagaries of history, that I will know exactly when I'm about to die because it's happening, and I will have time because the Romans are making it last a very long time, then I actually get to do it. So of course I'm going to say the Shema as I die, because this is the only time that anyone could possibly be able to fulfill this way of showing their love of God at such a point. And he prolonged his uttering of the word echad, of one, until his soul left his body as he uttered his final word, echad. So he carries on with the Shema, and as he is about to die, he is stretching out the word echad as long as he can, so that his soul will leave while he is in the midst of that recitation, that it is going to completely overlap. Now, it is customary now to say the Shema either for yourself or for a sick person when they are in danger of passing, partly out of a remembrance of this, and of course out of the meaning of the Shema itself. It is also very common to stretch the recitation of the Shema privately a little, not this long, of course, in order to remember that we are devoted to God all the way through up to the very last moment of our life. So this incident has impacted a lot of Jewish custom and ritual, and it is meant to also make us think on these ideas, well, at least twice a day, and of course in times of danger. Now, what is the result of all of this? A voice descended from heaven and said, "Happy are you, Rabbi Akiva, that your soul left your body as you uttered one." Meaning that he achieved what he wanted, that Rabbi Akiva was satisfied with the result of what had taken place, that his ability to be able to finally fulfill the mitzvah as he believed it needed to be fulfilled filled him with a sense of satisfaction. Now, does that mean we're done? Does that mean we're happy? Yay, he got what he wanted. Isn't that nice? Well, as always, the Talmud has a few more things to say. The ministering angels, so now we're back in the heavenly scene, said before the Holy One, blessed be he, this is Torah and this is its reward. So they are echoing the same confusion that Moses had when Moses saw likewise a glimpse of what would eventually happen to Rabbi Akiva. But here it's not Moses that is confused. It is all the heavenly court that is confused. So we are upping the stakes, if you will, of how difficult it is to understand these things. As it is stated, from death by your hand, O Lord, from death of the world, meaning your hand God kills and does not save. So they are basically saying, God, what's the point of Torah if you're not going to help people that exemplify Torah? This seems like a betrayal. I mean, you let him die. What were you doing? And then, and God said in the end of the verse to the ministering angels, whose portion is in this life, meaning, and then a divine voice emerged and said, happy are you, Rabbi Akiva, as you are destined for life in the worlds to come, as your portion is already in eternal life. So the resolution, which is not 100% complete for most of us as we read this, but it is trying to move us in a certain way. The resolution is to say, yes, this is horrible. Yes, the suffering is painful. Yes, this does not feel like a fair payment for the accomplishments of Rabbi Akiva. This does not match the human understanding of justice, of tit for tat, of midah keneged midah. But his soul has reached olam haba, has reached the world to come. And in the world to come, his portion is eternal life. that the suffering of the body is over, suffering of the body is temporary, his reward is infinite, and his reward is not going to be seen in this world. And that is something that is another aspect of Rabbi Akiva's original statement. You may remember we began with the phrase that everything that God does, he does for the best. And we talked about how that can be very useful in many situations for our day-to-day problems, the stub toe level of suffering. That, okay, we can imagine something that would be worse if this hadn't happened. So even though this is not as good, we can think that this might have been preventing something worse, and therefore I can be more willing to accept that what happened was not an unmitigated disaster. But this idea also allows a more expansive teaching, which is to say that whatever God does, he does for the best, up to and including the taking of the life, because ultimately the best is going to be reserved for us in Olam Haba. That any amount of reward or punishment that we see in this world is never going to properly match the full scale. It would be like trying to understand where you stand on in a grade book by looking at the assignments for a week without thinking that you're actually going to be graded over the course of an entire year. And that analogy I'm realizing is a little limited because it doesn't even consider the fact that ultimately what is going to be given as a reward for having learned well is maybe only going to occasionally show up in class, but the bulk of the reward will come once class has been dismissed. And you can get a little bit of praise in the teacher. Maybe they'll give you an early dismissal or a special privilege in class, but ultimately you're going to be enjoying the fruits of what you have learned beyond the confines of the classroom. And therefore, whatever happens in the classroom, if you have the best teacher, meaning God, well, it will work out for the best in the totality, including what's in the room and including what's outside the room, including what's in life and including what's outside of life. So, while it may have seemed that Rabbi Akiva was just talking about these trivial types of problems, the candle, the rooster, the donkey, the not having a room, in the end, Rabbi Akiva really meant this universally. He did feel that whenever we were faced with any form of suffering, that we would recognize that it is for the best, because the best includes more than just our narrow focus of this world. It includes what happens in Olam Haba, and up to his horrific death, that was still foremost in his heart. And the Talmud confirms that indeed that is where his true reward was given. Now, that's not satisfying for every situation. It's not satisfying for every person, as I warned at the beginning. And that's good, because that means we get to talk about some other alternatives next week. I hope that you also understand that Rabbi Akiva himself didn't exactly follow this pattern. You'll notice that when he was faced with the suffering of his people under Roman occupation, he didn't say everything God does for the best and just sit and study. He said, you know what? I think we need to have a revolution. Now, whether he was right or wrong, well, that is a big picture question for history to try and sort, and none of us will know the full answer to that until we stand before God ourselves. But the fact is, in this world, he was faced with a huge problem, the occupation of our people by the Romans and the persecution of us, and he chose action, not passivity. So while this phrase has become famous from him, whatever God does for the best, that he seemingly goes along with these problems, it actually turns out that he was one of the most activist of the rabbis, the most willing to put himself on the line to try and change and get rid of the suffering within his own lifetime, and approaching suffering with radical aggression and rebellion is something we'll talk about more next time. That this apparent passivity of Rabbi Akiva here is not exactly what he did all the time. And it's certainly not the passivity is certainly not the advice given by and large for most of our responses to suffering. Sometimes I think it's best to only think of this as a good technique to start with, especially for small things or things that are beyond our control. But for everything else, well, we'll talk about that next time. Take care, everyone, and be well.